Got to hold it.
Okay, good morning, everybody. So I've been told the food was great but not healthy last night. Welcome to the South. All good. It wasn't barbecue, I know, but food trucks are fun things, and I hope the beer was good for everybody. What we're going to do for the next few minutes is have our final debrief with our three experts up here. I'm going to talk to them about what they heard at the tables, what they think the themes are. Remember that the next step, and y'all will have a chance to ask some things and contribute also. The next step is we're going to set up 6 deeper dive subject tables in the room next door that we're going to ask you to self-select to go to. We've got some people we're going to help lead the conversations to try to dig as deep as we can into specific areas. And I know the challenge is there's about 40 areas that we'd love to dig on, but we're going to try to pick 6. Dig deep with the idea of understanding really what those issues are and sort of building a platform for how we move forward, and we'll talk about that after lunch, with helping you around those issues. That makes sense to everybody? So the next step is that deep dive. Oops. Let's see. So we'll get everybody, turn on here, and let's see, I'll get you.
Okay.
There we go. All right, Andy, mic check for you.
Test 1, 2. Good.
All right.
Bill? Yes.
All right, everybody.
Okay.
We'll try to speak up because I know directional mics are a little bit tough this time of the morning. And I brought my coffee up on stage, so what y'all hear? I mean, I loved listening to how good the conversations were going next door, but you want to get us started? What'd you hear?
Wow, it's complicated. I think we talked a lot about what is the economic niche of small cities, and that it's not going to be to become a miniature version of Boston or Pittsburgh, but it's got to relate to the reality of these cities. And one thing that I saw as a real plus was the extent to which these cities, many of them, cities represented in the room, have quite strong manufacturing bases, significantly above the national average. And I think there's some evidence that manufacturing is, at least at a modest level, a growth sector in this country and has the potential to become a significant economic base. But then it raised a lot of very important questions about how these communities frame themselves, how they build their talent. I heard a lot of stuff about how communities had manufacturing jobs but couldn't find people to fill them. And that becomes a whole question of how do you not so much recruit talent, but how do you build talent from within the community, which goes to a whole larger, almost philosophical question of, do we value all career paths and outcomes equally, or do we devalue people who don't go to college? And what the implications of that, and do we devalue industrial work versus brain work, if you will? Which is actually not a fair juxtaposition, because industrial work is more and more also brain work. And also, and a third part of this is, if a small city is going to have a strong manufacturing base, and is going to be a city that is heavily, if you will, and I realize the term has a lot of associations, blue collar, what should a city be focusing on in terms of how it builds its quality of life? And there's a number of people commented in a number of different cities, a kind of a disconnect between what local elites, local decision makers are promoting in terms of local quality of life, which tends to be focused very much on that quality of life standard that's desired by what you might call the educated tribe, versus the quality of life issues that might be important for the much larger population of people who are not college graduates and do not share in what I think of as sort of the latte and sriracha culture.
Okay.
So I think those are all issues. I'm not entirely sure of what the answers are, but these are issues that I thought were just absolutely, both fascinating and challenging and incredibly important in terms of how cities think about their futures.
You hear similar things at your table?
Yeah, I mean, I've been out of this, but thinking back to the 1990s when I was really covering this on a kind of day-to-day basis as a journalist in Kentucky, the conversation has changed so dramatically, and I attribute that to all of you all. I mean, it's no longer, can we get the chicken processing plant to come to our community, and you all are talking about the right things. What struck me from the community aspect is that this collapse of church and of trust in government and of trust in schools and in trust in one another and in places even where people meet on a regular basis, come together for community events, was beginning to, that missingness was showing up in our towns, and we're going to pay the price for that in terms of connecting, practically in terms of connecting people to jobs, but also in moving communities forward rather than sectors or programs forward.
So just picking up on Alan's comment here, a joke I heard a number of years ago talked about the factory of the future. They said, the factory of the future will be run by a man and a dog. The man's job will be to feed the dog. The dog's job will be to bite the man if he tries to touch any of the equipment. So I do worry that, you talk about the manufacturing. Ted, it was interesting to see your chart. Basically it's tailed off down to about 70% of what it was.
What it was 20 years ago. Yeah.
And has
employment, not an output.
Unemployment is
yeah.
now leveled off, is what
Yeah.
I saw from
Yes.
that chart. So I do worry that there's going to be a second hit as we look towards more automation. On the other hand, I've read lots of stuff that people say, if you go back 25, 30 years, the jobs that people are taking now are ones that hadn't even been dreamed up yet. So, there will be other stuff that comes into that. Just to take you in maybe a similar but different area, to me, the interesting discussion that we had at our tables and a little bit last night with some people was this sort of, in terms of this, if workforce is this big issue, do we focus on growing our own or do we try to attract from the outside? I only work in the attraction from the outside, so I don't know the workforce development space as well, but it's, I think that's a big issue that all of you face, because that seemed to be a central theme. The other theme that sort of came out as the different groups were talking at the end of yesterday's session that I found interesting was just recovery from the loss of a major employer and sort of what it does to the community and how psychologically a community recovers and gets back from that situation. I talked a little bit about Danville as being one of those communities, but there were others that talked about that. So those were two of the themes that stuck out in my head.
One of the questions about manufacturing that the data sort of shed some light on it, yes, there's no doubt that automation is going to, unless we export a whole lot more stuff, automation is going to continue to whittle away at jobs, but it's also going to continue to raise the quality of those jobs, probably the wages of those jobs, and therefore might not actually change the impact of local wealth on if you're a manufacturing place, your local wealth might stay relatively the same. So you'll have fewer people working by a little, but they'll be making more and spreading more around your community, so the overall impact of manufacturing in your community might not be much different. And we don't know that yet. We don't know, what the overall impact will be. The question of elitism, which is sort of popular these days to talk about, I heard the theme that we're looking for more opportunity for more people in our community, and we're also looking for more quality of life, place, assets for more people in our community. That I don't know why people decide to pick on bike trails, because they're nice and I think most people like them, but if it's bike trails and lattes and whatever, are you dealing with everybody, or is public safety or more softball fields, or, I mean, it seems obvious that there ought to be a balance in those kind of things. If you're a local government trying to help your community, what's the disconnect there?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. And going back to your earlier point, I mean, I think the issue of jobs is a really thorny one because, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen with automation. But even if automation does increase the level of the individual job but results in fewer jobs overall, that may be a wash statistically, but it may mean that there are an awful lot of people in that community who don't have jobs anymore. Sure. And the problem, of course, and I frankly dread the prospects of some of the projections that I'm seeing about the impact of automation and robotics potentially, because jobs aren't just a means to get a paycheck. They are, for I think most people, a fundamental to identity, self-worth, and culture. So I think that's just a whole huge, very problematic issue that is sort of looming potentially on the horizon. But I think people are very good at maintaining disconnects, mental disconnects. And I think what we have, what I've seen constantly, is where, on the one hand, excuse me, yes, people do, at one level, believe that it's critical to provide opportunity for all, quality of life for all, and what have you. And yet, and this is the power of tribal thinking, when they actually think of what that means, they tend to think of it in terms of what their tribe values. And the reality is that the great majority of people who make decisions about things like quality of life issues and opportunity issues in communities, large and small, are part of the educated, college graduate, professional tribe. And it takes not just good intentions, but a conscious, determined act of will to see beyond the self-definition of your tribe. Always has. Go back to Paleolithic times, it did.
Clearly an area that I think we're going to try to dig a little bit more in. What else did you hear? What other areas were people really interested in this morning?
Well, I'm going to go back to what I was, it's going to sound funny, but what I've realized in listening to this is the community is not a place. You know, community is not a softball field. Community isn't a Austin, Texas, where I lived, had a walkable neighborhoods and parks. I lived right across the street from a park. Well, we had a pitch-in dinner, one pitch-in dinner, and everybody brought their own little meal from Whole Foods, right? We had the place. We could walk there, ride our bikes there. Everything was perfect, according to the sort of urbanist view of things, and they didn't know how to do it, and so, but it's those. And so the 4th of July parade, I heard a county fair in southern Ohio is gone because the law lacks support. So what happens, how do we rebuild those institutions that and that way of life that has these beneficial aspects for people and economies? And that I haven't heard, but what I've heard is that people are recognizing that, that's starting to go missing.
So one of the issues that we thought we would dig deeper into is how do you build these collaborative models, both public and private sector, and I think that's on our list of how do you build that, but you're also talking about social cohesion and social capital and all of those things that are part of building a fabric that seem to be missing.
And what the expectations are out of community, so that community is not something you just sort of feed on. Oh, well, I'll go here to the brew pub. I'll go here to the, it's not entertainment, it's obligation. And I think that, when I was in Tupelo, the people there, that sense that, yes, you had an obligation to the people around you in the community you lived in that was strong and daily. And what happens when that goes missing? Is there a way to reinstill that sense of obligation?
I just want to go ahead and warn you, I saw Linda write feverishly. That's sort of the pull quote of the day, so I'll make sure you didn't steal it from anybody. That's yours, right?
What was that?
The community is not entertainment, it's obligations. I like that one a lot.
Okay.
Okay, good. All right. Y'all will see that later. I'm 100%
I'm
sure.
sure
I
we stole
know her for a long time, and her eyes went, pull quote. Got it. All right. So all good. Andy, what do you think?
I'm going to try to work on that now. But,
yes, Andy, your job is to make Linda go, ooh, pull
yeah,
quote. Okay.
Get ready.
What else did you hear?
I work in a different space than I think the three of you, and so it leads to a different point of view. But there was something that a colleague said from Kalamazoo, Michigan, a guy named Ron Kitchen. Some of you may know him, but he had this quote, and I may misquote it a little bit, but he basically said, the best social welfare program is a good job with health care. So, we can talk about all these things in terms of building community, but to me, that sort of like is the base of community building, is if you can gainfully employ people, provide them with their health care now. I have a son who is having to go on Obamacare in about a month, and he's terrified. That combination to me is very powerful, and it's sort of a foundational kind of thing towards community building.
Yeah. I agree completely. I think that's the thing. There are a lot of things we have to be thinking about, but if a community cannot provide decent jobs, parentheses, and health care, close parentheses, for the people who live there, it's behind the eight ball to begin with. Then once you can provide the jobs, then you can, I hope there are ways you can start to build from that and start to create this idea of a community, which I wish I knew how to reinstill that. I think we have gone so far down the road of moving away from a lot of those ideas of shared values. I was very struck by the comment one of the people made yesterday about how the people in his community think of themselves as customers rather than citizens. And that is very powerful, because we've had all kinds of people, these marketing people who sort of go out to these city governments and try to retrain city people to think of their people as consumers, and et cetera, customers, consumers. But ultimately, if we can't bring back some kind of sense of community and shared identity and shared obligation, then all we do have is places.
So let's talk about the jobs for a minute. I've heard some themes of attraction, business retention and expansion. We didn't talk about it yesterday hardly at all, but last night during the beer part of the evening, I heard people say, why haven't y'all talked about entrepreneurship? And good question. Any thought, did you hear people talking about sort of the balance of how a community, if we're going to have to find the right jobs, if that's going to be the piece of it, how do we go about that? What were people saying?
Some discussion at my table last night focusing on retention and how can we do retention better. And it's just so much easier to take a company that's already in your community and work with them and try to scale them up than to find someone from the outside. So to me, that makes a lot of sense. I think it gets maybe less financial commitment and resources behind it because it's a little less sexy than the new plant and the new facility and that kind of thing. But if you're really trying to impact, the financial health of your community, that is, to me, the low-hanging fruit. So I think more focus in that area, more resources, I just think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think it's important. We had some very interesting conversations about issues like, about the question, to what extent does entrepreneurship matter? We know that startups are way down, generally speaking, in our economy compared to historical eras. We know that, again, people tend not to think about building companies for the long haul, the multi-generational kind of company that people thought about 100 years ago. Most of the companies in a community are likely to be increasingly branches of companies headquartered elsewhere than locally owned companies. So I think it's important for each city, and this is where it goes back to something I said yesterday. Each city has to figure out, what are we about? Who are we? And really look at what is your economic mix? What are your companies? Who are they? Who can you help grow? Because I agree completely with Andy that retaining and helping grow the companies that are already in the community is probably the single most important economic development strategy, and should, above either helping startups, I would put attracting companies second and helping startups third, because the failure rates of startups are so huge, and our ability to predict winners and losers in that area is so poor that I don't think that's a high productivity strategy in most communities.
So for the group, both the International Economic Development Council's latest research paper is on business retention and attraction, and we'll make sure that you have that. And then the Organization for International Investment has a nice piece on what they refer to as aftercare, which is the European model of how do you deal with companies over the long haul. And we'll make sure that that ends up in the share file too. They talk about aftercare of attraction and then forever care of companies, and that's more the European thinking. It's normally shorthanded as BRE in the American culture, but we'll make sure both of those get in there.
Someone in my group brought up also, I think it's Les, where are you here? Somewhere?
Yeah.
Oh, there. So you were bringing up that, I was saying, where are your best community leaders coming from? And one of your observations was second and third generation locally owned companies. Those are the people who are like super invested in your community. I don't know if you want to expand on that at all, but to me it was like an interesting aha.
So today, because we can't pick up for the video your voices when we roll the mic, we put the mic in the middle right here, so we're going to ask all of you to pop up and talk into that, and then we'll capture you.
Right by Les.
Right by Les. I don't know why, but that's what we're going to ask for today, rather than running around, so we can get you on tape today.
Actually, you said it very well. What I will add is, from a community foundation perspective, we look at where is the core of philanthropy in the community? Where's the leadership in philanthropy? And it is the families and those businesses that they own. And the philanthropists we work with are typically second and third generation. And they have roots in the community, they feel a sense of gratitude to the community, and they typically have children who are in the schools, and they care about the future. And they typically care about the future of their employees. And so they are involved. They're the ones who give the leadership in the business sector. And for us, the managers of many of the businesses that are quite large, but that are owned outside the community, are no-shows in terms of either philanthropy with the community foundation or being involved in community leadership. Even some of the corporations that are locally owned and headquartered, but are very large, are less engaged than those that have that family commitment to personal and to corporate engagement.
Someone else in our group also brought up the point, though, at some point, those second and third generation people are likely to be bought out.
Yep.
And then change occurs, and their commitment is diminished.
think it's a diminishing asset.
That's correct. And, you know, I think the point was made, and we agree with it, is that you build relationships with those families along the way. And what we hope is, from a philanthropic point of view and a community leadership point of view, is that we are at the table when that sale is about to occur. So we can help them think through both the transfer of wealth and the transfer of community commitment to the next generation, or to some institution like a family foundation that will continue to serve the community.
Let's keep talking leadership, because that has popped up a few times, and some of it in the vein of how do you get public and private to collaborate, but also where do you just find leadership in communities around issues? Was that something that came at your tables or not? Don't want to push it if it didn't, but did you hear people talk about leadership?
No.
No.
Little
Yeah.
bit, in terms of the disconnect, this issue of the disconnect
Okay.
between the leadership vision on the one hand, and some of the larger underlying issues and dynamics in the community.
My group asked me for my greatest failure, and then someone else in the group said, yeah, something really humiliating.
Yep.
So that was, we didn't get into leadership.
No, you just want to do it.
Do you want to share it with us?
You have to hear from the rest of the group.
Andy's heard me tell this story before, but back in 2001, back in the dark ages, we were doing the first big strategic plan for the Research Triangle region, and I was the executive vice president of the regional group, and we got 24, and literally 24 of the 26 we tried for CEOs of the biggest companies in the Triangle, and the 6 university presidents to act as a steering committee to figure out what we needed to do. And we put them in a room, and they had an all-day retreat, and the head of the UNC system was one of the co-chairs, and the ex-governor was another co-chair. And we went for about 20, 30 minutes around this idea of, here are our metrics and all of this. And somebody raised their hand from the back of the room and said, what we really need to find is leadership around this issue. And everybody jumped up and said, yeah, we got to find some leaders. And I'm sitting on the front row, and I lost my mind. It's like, who do you think's going to lead? The 24 largest companies in there. This is Glaxo and IBM and Cisco, all these people sitting here, and they didn't know who the leadership was going to be. And I've always learned the lesson that you've got to find the leaders for the issues. Everybody in that room led something, but they didn't lead everything. They didn't lead the community, and so it was a hard lesson to learn, but we drug them along for a while along that. What about metrics? Did you hear people talk about measuring success? We heard that some yesterday. What does success mean in a community?
I mean, besides bike paths?
Well, I don't know, bike paths, yeah. Does it mean jobs? Does it mean happiness? Does it,
Didn't discuss that in our
Income, raising income rather than adding people was one bit of discussion, and
the idea that population gain may not be the only measure that
Right.
you're looking at? Okay.
I did at one point, I was trying to write an article, and I looked at the 12 communities in America that had shown the greatest income level gains.
Yep.
And I tried to piece together what the commonalities were. I couldn't find any commonalities. They were all like individual stories.
just
And
one-off
it
stories.
it was hard to piece together a theme around it, so.
Well, I'm going to ask a broader question for y'all here. One of the things we struggle with when we're trying to look at best practices is that a lot of people do averages, and averages hide real people stories. The average wage in the community is $40,000, and that doesn't tell you anything, because there's people who make a lot and a little. And the converse of that, or the opposite of that, is that we also talk about individual stories. And this program helped these 11 people, and therefore that must be the story. As groups, these are, sorry to say, these are actually, the responsibility lies with a lot of people in this room. How should they interpret information to try to make the best decision possible? Because it's a really hard balancing act between the episodic versus the average that doesn't mean anything.
Okay, I think the story, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. I think we've been sold And, you know, I've spent over the years, I've participated in a variety of workshops of marketing people, where I've been involved in nonprofits or local governments, and they've brought in marketing people to talk about how can you get your message out, and it's always about tell people stories. Okay, so
We didn't move.
I didn't do anything. Honest, I didn't do anything. And yes, I mean, if you're a nonprofit and you're trying to do fundraisers and send out mailings and get people to write back checks, stories may be the answer. I don't know, but it's possible. But in terms of helping to plan and organize a strategy for a community, they really don't tell you anything. And the problem is averages, in a few cases they may, but they very often don't. For an average income doesn't tell you anything about the distribution of incomes. You could have a pretty high average, and in fact I know communities that have high average incomes because they've got a lot of very well-to-do people and a lot of very poor people. And other communities that may have a lower average, but actually have a much more egalitarian distribution of income with far less poverty. So you really have to be very thoughtful about both identifying what are your metrics, which is hard enough, but then once you've identified, do you want to look at income, do you want to look at jobs, do you want to look at happiness, however you measure that, do you want to look at quality of life, but then what exactly are the metrics that you use to measure those things, and how do you look at it? I know it's an interesting example. A lot of cities, for example, measure safety on the basis of the homicide rate. Now, I'm not saying it's irrelevant, obviously, but what I found when I did a lot of work, and this was particularly in neighborhoods, you know, why were people leaving the solid middle-class neighborhoods of Detroit starting roughly around the turn of the millennium? And one of the things that was very interesting, people kept saying, it's not about the murder. We don't have murders. It's about the little stuff. It's about the break-ins. It's about the brick through the car window. It's about the trash on the lawn. It's about stuff that the city had basically wasn't even on the city government's or the police department's radar, but it was driving people up a wall and driving the middle class right out of the city. Probably the single most important factor. And so this is a huge issue. Both what do you measure and how do you measure it? And we're not doing a great job at it.
Yeah, one of our pet peeves as data geeks is that you measure a lot. We measure lots of things. We think you need a bunch of things to actually understand. And yet, every time we go somewhere, especially, I hope I don't offend anybody, especially legislatures, they want the three things. Give, 3 bullets. Tell me the 3 bullets that define my entire economy. And it's like, well, okay, you can measure them, but they don't tell you a whole lot. So measurement's clearly an issue.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Let's accept the fact and try to educate ourselves and each other in the fact that this stuff is complicated and it's multidimensional. And it's not going to be boiled down to a single or even 3 simple bullets. And that we have to deal with that complexity and acknowledge it.
I think that I disagree a little bit with the two of you, and we'll see if Bill is my ally in this.
Just because
as a
you're the
journalist,
smartest marketers are in? Okay.
That's it, yes, okay.
Got it. All right.
So I always think of like a Wall Street Journal story, and the structure of it is, it usually starts with an example, a human, and then as you get into the story, there will be some statistics, something that backs up that this is a trend. But we're gonna tell the story of sweet Juanita, who's done something interesting, and here it is as a trend nationally, and to show that. So as a communications challenge within your community, if you show up at a community meeting or whatever with, I have this 40-page report, or I have these 700 slides. I've seen many of your PowerPoints, Ted, You know, there's lots of
I think
data.
I think 280 is the max. but
280 is
it's
the max, okay. Well, but if you do that, you're just gonna, I fear you're gonna lose the audience, and you're never gonna make your point. But if you can say, here's an example, here's a human being, and go to those 3 key numbers, you know, the vital few, the few things that really can be grasped by either the public officials that you're dealing with, or even the private sector folks that you're working with. Yeah, there's a lot of them are really smart with data, but they have a lot of distractions, and you know a PowerPoint deck that has 3 slides in it may be a whole lot more powerful than 100 slides in it. So
I will accept the correction. I think
I
there's
won't. No, I won't for a second.
No, I think-
but is the conflict.
Yeah,
This is
I
the,
think
the
you've got
serious
to
conflict.
you've got to be able to communicate stuff to people.
I agree.
And you've got to be able to communicate stuff to people who are not data geeks. And you've got to figure out how to do that. And telling Juanita's story can be a way to get through, to open the issue or open their minds to the issue behind Juanita's story. But ultimately, when you're sitting down and trying to figure out how to make particular capital investments, or where to put your resources, or which choices to make, and you're constantly making choices especially with public resources. At that point, you've got to go.
it's more complicated.
More
Bill, jump in
complicated.
here. Help us here.
Yeah, I mean, we're tortured by stories. My God, I mean, everybody writes. I mean, how many memoirs is Shelley Winters or no, what's her name? Yeah, I mean,
Shirley
people
MacLaine.
write Shirley
Shirley
MacLaine.
MacLaine.
Shirley
I got
MacLaine
it.
has written like 8 memoirs, and so.
Well, she has 8 lives. So
It's
it's okay.
serious.
It works.
Yeah,
But here's the danger: is that, I mean, and journalists know this. In fact, it happened with the big sword. Look, we can see masses of people separating into these different tribes. You know, oh, can you find some real? You know, go ahead and find some real people to. And what it does is it tells you that the phenomenon you're writing about and talking about is an individual one, and so it therefore solutions are individual, and the solutions are not individual. The solutions are in a group and in an economy, and by telling individual stories, it gets us all off track. Although it's the only way that people
Yeah,
communicate
here,
these days,
we always
because
say, yeah.
we're so focused on the individual rather than the group that we can't see what really is important.
And
to
we
us.
tell people, well, if you torture data enough, it'll confess anything. I mean, it just will.
It's not like
And
people.
so I get calls all the time from people with the story already who say, I need a data point that proves this.
Right.
Right.
And you say, well, here's a data point. It doesn't prove anything. That's okay.
I got it.
Got it.
And there's the
Yeah.
story. So, but your point that you've got to make it understandable, useful, actionable is actually the last piece. You've got to actually know what to do with it. I agree with you completely. I'm going to open it up to Mike. What else were y'all hearing? What things have we missed that are part of your core concerns that you'd like for us to dig a little deeper in? Because I want to make sure we cover everything. And there's the mic.
Come on,
Okay,
Julie.
Here we go. Julie, got.
I'll start this.
That wasn't real quick though. You didn't scoot. Okay. Where to?
One of
And
Bill's,
speak up, please.
can you hear me?
You're quiet. Speak.
I am. One of Bill's groups, I think, had a really interesting conversation about the relationship of the poverty of culture and poverty cycles to the economic development strategies that are being created in communities, how they can't be separated. And I think it is, in fact, for many places, a significant and almost an intractable part of thinking about how you get people productively into the workforce and build assets. But it led me to really think a bit about, if we're thinking about that arc of opportunity, how does that actually get included in the messaging you do about the work that you're doing, the goals that you're setting, and the actionable results that you expect that really do promote inclusive prosperity? So it was a very interesting conversation.
It is, and one of the problems with generational solutions is, nobody's got the attention span past. Right, that's hard. It's hard to talk about long-term solutions to much of anything these days. Comments or other things people want to? Yep, that's why it's here.
I have a couple of questions. I think it all boils down to how do we influence human behavior on a large scale. So how do we do it, and who or what can do it? Because that's like, I mean, we talk about all these, creating community and creating place and all that stuff, but it's all about how are we positively influencing the kind of behavior we want to see out of large groups of people. Throw that out.
Clearly, it's a marketing question.
It's not just
Wasn't
a
so clear to
marketing
me, but
question.
okay. So how do we get people to behave? And I'll sort of go back maybe to the storytelling side. It's I think having small victories and just promoting them in large ways. And so if I don't know what would be an example of a community problem, but if you can. You need to sort of within a community create certain legends of success, and then start small, do something small, and then grow it larger and larger and larger over time. But you need to create that legend up front in areas, and then expand it. I mean, that would be my suggested approach to it. So baby steps first. Don't try to change entire behavior of 100,000 people. But if you can start small and then tell that story effectively within the community, tell that story of success, you can grow it and you can make it bigger and extend it to other parts of the community. So my initial response.
We talk about community narratives a lot. It's one of the first things we do when we go into a community is tell us your narrative. Tell us about yourself. And if they don't know what to say, then you've got a problem. If they start talking about 1973, you've got a problem. So what are the narratives? And then if you can build a new arc, a new storyline, then people invite a sociologist in sometime or a psychologist to talk up to your group about how people process information. And they process it by connecting it to something they already know. So if you can build the drawers that connects, then you can start changing the way they believe something's happening in their community.
I had one thing to this, and I mentioned in the talk Ted and I had yesterday. I said we had TED Talk, right?
It was TED Talk.
Okay, good. Okay. We talked about Salinas, and so their new narrative was ag tech capital of the United States, and we told that story in the community, but it really took off when like the San Jose Mercury News or the Los Angeles Times or the Wall Street Journal wrote about them. It's kind of like when a third-party outside expert says something good about you. The best example I can give you that, we were working with Tacoma, Washington, and Tacoma was sort of the sister city to Seattle that really had this sort of ugly stepsister. They talked about the Tacoma aroma from all the paper plants that were around, spitting out bad smells and that sort of thing. But we had arranged for the New York Times to go there, and they wrote a very, very positive story about Tacoma. And the next day in the local paper, the editorial board wrote, "It's Tacoma's rebound is for real," and the focus was, well, the New York Times says we've changed, so we must have changed. But as I talked to the mayor of the city, he said, the article in the New York Times was really good. That was a fantastic article, Andy. The article in the Tacoma News Journal was like life-changing, and it sort of just turned around our community. So I think an external expert saying something good is going on is very powerful.
Yeah, but I think I like to qualify that. I mean, I recognize this importance, but if a narrative doesn't have a compelling plot line, it's not a good narrative. And I think, just telling a story about yourself to make you feel good or to try to get some good PR, ultimately in the end isn't going to work unless it's backed up by some real substance of what's happening on the ground. And I think a lot of cities have to figure out what do they have and what is the story, not just that is a nice story, but actually they can use to further whatever their goals are, whether in terms of increasing jobs or income or wealth or whatever. And I think it's really important, especially when you're a small city and you're literally, one of hundreds in this country competing for attention with the big boys, is to think about what can you do or what can you be that can separate you from the crowd
Authentic matters.
in a
So it
meaningful
does.
way that is authentic and that is not simply just, city X, town of the Blue Dahlia or something. It's not just promotion, but is substance and that can really work to build I'll just make one other example. The outside attention can backfire. Also, Detroit has had a spate of articles from national and even international media over the last 3 years about their rebound and revitalization and so forth. And for most of the people in Detroit who aren't feeling the love exactly and aren't seeing the benefits, this has become a source of extraordinarily local, almost I'd say anger.
Yeah.
It's what the hell is going on? Don't these people recognize that there's a reality and not this hype?
I'll give
So-
you a very similar example from Jersey City, New Jersey. They built this incredible advertising campaign that displayed Jersey City, and they ran it, and the people at Jersey City almost revolted and said, "That's not us," and it wasn't authentic, and it completely failed.
Reality, marketing is important, but reality can trump marketing.
Will, what you got to say today?
Hey everyone, good morning. Will Lamb from the Federal Reserve down in Atlanta. I want to try to drill down to what I think might be at the heart of this discussion, at least from one person's perspective. So some of us have talked some about this idea of the arc of growth and the arc of opportunity. And that notion really comes from the sort of typical, call it a small town, medium-sized town, large city, whatever, circumstance and places where you have a group of leadership that is working hard, subsidizing with philanthropic and public resources, and providing real leadership on initiatives and efforts that help a local or regional economy grow. So the typical kind of economic development activities. And then in most places, some more than others, there's also a set of people, and the Venn diagrams of who these people are sometimes overlap a little bit, but oftentimes don't at all, who are focused on the things that address distributional imbalances in the economy. So this is, programming to help the poor kids on the west side of town, realize better outcomes, et cetera. And if you're a Martian in this sort of Robin Hackey, David Wood kind of model, and you land in any particular city, you can see lots of evidence that the economic growth crowd in almost any city dictates the priorities of that particular place. So this is where you see in Atlanta, we have 2 new shiny stadiums, and which have been subsidized to the tune of billions of dollars. And that's just one example. We have a belt line, which is great if you've been on it, a loop around the city where people can ride their bikes, et cetera, which is great. That's how I get to work. But there's not a lot of evidence that the priorities of that particular place are manifesting necessarily in better opportunities for people. So my question is, sort of fundamentally, how do we think about a set of incentives or disincentives, whatever those may be, that compel the leadership that make real decisions about where subsidy dollars go? Because all this stuff is subsidized in one way or another with public and philanthropic and other kinds of resources. So if we're going to subsidize growth, then that's great, but that's not necessarily going to create better outcomes for poor kids. So how do we, in a serious and strategic way, as a set of people who care about these issues, talk about opportunity as being connected to growth in serious and substantive ways. So for example, the way I see it is, and then I'll move on, is that if you're a corporate executive in Hickory and your business is dependent on, to some degree, the health of Hickory's local and regional economy, then there's 3 channels, as I see it, through which the distributional imbalances, the pockets of poverty in Hickory limit your business's success. One of them is that if Hickory's economy is creating a bunch of poor families without resources to spend, then your consumer base is limited. The second is that if Hickory's economy is creating unskilled workers or people without the ability to take the jobs that your company may be creating, then your business's trajectory is limited. And the last is that if your economy is creating social unrest, a la Ferguson, et cetera, then there could be social explosions of various sorts that limit your business's growth potential. And so I really feel passionate and absolutely steadfast in the idea that we have to do a better job of framing the opportunity arc, if you will, as a way to connect the growth potential of a place to interventions that are tied to the risk to business or on the upside, the potential for businesses to do better. I'll stop there. Thank you. And so my question is, how do we do that?
So I was hoping that from the Federal Reserve you would have swag bags for everybody here, but that's okay.
That's just as good. Let me talk about that a little bit, because unfortunately, I'm not convinced. First, I share your passionate commitment, and I think, as I tried to convey yesterday, that the issue of creating opportunity and dispersing opportunity throughout our population and our society is perhaps the most important challenge that as a nation and a society we are facing. At the same time, I'm not convinced that any of those arguments are all that compelling when push comes to shove. I wrote a paper a few years ago. I called it The Uncoupling of the Economic City. And I documented very rigorously, based on data from 2000 up to 2014, how essentially the workforce of the companies in city after city in this country has become regional and less located in the city in which the company is located on a massive basis. And as far as companies are concerned, especially companies when the headquarters are 3,000 miles away, if they get workers to show up at the plant, that's really all that matters. And for the most part, they are managing to do so. There are imbalances that appear, and when those imbalances appear, the problem is it's always easier to train somebody who's almost there than to train somebody for whom it's a major strategic, systemic effort to take from where they are today to where they need to be in order to participate effectively in a good paying job in the workforce. So another issue which we haven't talked about, which came up in our group briefly, is the fact that in many of the communities we're talking about, the economic divide, the tribal divide, is also a racial divide. And that adds, I won't belabor it, I think everybody in this room probably appreciates that, which adds a whole other dimension of complexity in all kinds of ways to grappling with this issue. And I think ultimately, the only way I think you can essentially get the leadership to rethink priorities is if the people who care about these issues organize in an effective, coherent way with a coherent agenda, in contrast to the fragmented way in which most of those people currently pursue their activities and pursue their individual organization or agency or government departments or whatever activities, and essentially create a situation in which there is no voice to be heard because there are 1,000 voices that are being heard instead of a coherent single voice.
Now, I don't think we have the answer to Will's question, do we?
Amen.
Okay, all right, that was good.
I do, but let's
Oh,
move
do
on.
you? Okay.
Okay. Mine's sort of, I
You're not gonna
guess,
tell
on
us
the last
because
part
you
of that
didn't
vein.
go out of
So
my
it's kind of an Andy question. So I think, so Cedar Rapids, Iowa, strong manufacturing sector, 90-mile labor shed. We've pretty much depleted that. Can't find, every employer we meet with can't find skilled workers. We have one of the highest ranked community colleges in the nation as far as their education and training programs. They work very close with employers. So it's not for lack of trying, not for lack of resources, literally because of lack of bodies for us. Our workforce development programs and our workforce attraction campaigns have largely been focused on what we've been talking about, that third of millennials that fit that highly educated section. We don't have problems recruiting for our engineering jobs, for our finance jobs. The top, professionals, they tend to be mobile, and you can recruit, and we pay well. So the more difficult challenge, and probably why we're struggling so much, is because it is those like middle skills workers, like everybody always talks about, that we're still kind of in need of. But it sounds like as we're talking here, there's a lot of places with unemployment, but largely not that simple because they tend to be immobile. So I guess I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on kind of changing the focus on workforce attraction away from simply, the college kids and trying to make sure that the four-year grads stick around, or how do we go to universities and work with them on recruiting versus like how do you recruit somebody who's like in their 40s and maybe has some industrial experience, and that's the challenge I think we face.
So, a couple of comments. Probably most of the talent attraction programs we've focused on have worked on that higher end skilled area. The couple that we've done in sort of more the sort of manufacturing skills, that sort of thing, have done recently with Cleveland County, North Carolina, as well as probably the most interesting one was for the state of Wyoming. I'll start again, and I said this yesterday. I think looking for people that have existing connections to your community is just easier. If you can reach out to someone with that skill set that knows Cedar Rapids, that's just an easier thing to do. So how do you identify that group? The easiest way to identify folks are people who've been in your either high school or college system. If you can get those databases, that's sort of a running start. A lot of times people don't want to share that stuff. So you need some political power in order to get access to that. But, for the communities that we have gone about, and Michigan, well, Wyoming was an interesting example. So there were all these open jobs in Wyoming in the natural gas and the energy sector. And they came to us and said, we see that in Detroit, in Michigan, there's pretty high unemployment at the time. This is a couple of years ago. And could we successfully attract out-of-work auto workers to relocate to Wyoming? And so we built a program around that. It was pretty successful. Ultimately, about 400 families moved from Detroit, Michigan to Wyoming. And about a year later, 150 moved back, because it was too difficult a adjustment for them. And there were some problems in Wyoming as well, so that group didn't fit in very well. So that's why I sort of lean towards, people that already know Cedar Rapids in one way or another, trying to identify those that have the skill sets that you're looking for. And that's a pretty tall order. That's not an easy thing to do. But if you can do that and then communicate with those guys, I think that's your fastest path to success. But it's certainly not an easy thing to do.
Just out of curiosity, did
I
Wyoming
think-
subsidize the relocation?
Did Wyoming? No, it did not. No.
So this is I need to get, I'm getting to this from behind quickly.
Okay, just very quickly. I mean, we know a couple of things about mobility and willingness to move. That it decline, the less education, formal education you have, the less mobile you are, and the older you are, the less mobile you are. So that's why so many young college graduates are moving a lot, but middle-aged people, people with high school diplomas and so forth, are very reluctant to move to a new, strange place.
This is the last one of the mics, and then Clark, I'm going to ask you to come up after that and get us on to the next thing. Okay.
Okay, just real quick, maybe an answer from each of you. Back to metrics, an example or a solution to how to measure collaboration.
So we do measure civic engagement with a bunch of things that are everything from voting patterns to things like that. But so I guess I'd have to ask you, who do you want to measure collaboration between?
All right, so I'll use, just to get a step away from my own world,
Yep.
if we just focused on all the myriad of resources that address talent development,
Yep.
so is that enough of a
Yeah, so
example?
If you're measuring, so if you measure collaboration between workforce organizations or workforce pipeline organizations, some of the things you would look at is board participation that crosses. You would look at joint projects, how many you can identify. You would look at who funds who, how many people actually have a fiscal relationship with each other. You would look at proximity of organizations and overlap of their footprints, where they're actually attracting people. And then one of the things you might look at is how many people they actually jointly serve. So how many people are in line, so I get this and this and this and this. But they're not, those are all things you're going to have to create. They are not standard publicly available data. But I'd start with that. So Clark's going to come up in a minute and talk about how we're going to dig a little deeper. I want to take a minute though, and the three guys on the stage with us, we didn't pay them to come. They didn't get any money. They wanted to come because they thought this issue was important. And that's pretty amazing. Yeah, I know. Well, whatever side deal you have with, this is a little bit like guys showing up at tennis conferences. You know, if you get someone at the table. It's really amazing to have them spend 2 days with us, just having this kind of conversation and interaction. We didn't invite them to airplane in and do the 35 minutes and take the check and run back out. And that all of them have said they want to stay involved with whatever efforts we have, whatever we dream up this afternoon. Some of them have to leave in a few minutes, but whatever.
You mean we're not getting paid?
Yeah, I know, you said this before, so yeah, that's all right. So hire Andy to do something for you, it'll be good.
Yeah.
But this is the type of conference, the type of meeting we wanted to have, where there was interchange and access. So
You get a mug.
Yes, I know, give me it. The thing that I want to do is acknowledge them for their thinking. They've all been involved in thinking really hard about these subjects for a really long time, and I want you to help me thank them.